Hey everybody, Vintage Iron back here. Hey, I hope everybody had a great Christmas. I'm making this video because of, because of you really. We did the best and worst small block Chevrolet head video. We did a part 2 where we took a look at the throttle body injection heads, the Vortec heads and so forth. I've got several requests for people wanting me to do a video on big block Chevrolet heads. Well, I kind of hesitated, and the reason I hesitated is because big block Chevrolets, I mean, it's a huge issue. You could do lots of videos on these because there's so much to know about these things. But I put together a few things and hopefully this will help. So I decided just to go back to the basics and talk about some of the history of the big block Chevy. So we'll go back and we'll start at the beginning. The first year for a big block Chevrolet, what we call the Generation 1 head, was 1958. And they made those big blocks through 1965, the early part of 65. That's what they call the Generation 1 big block Chevrolet head. That was the 348, the 409, and they also made a 427 for a few years. Now, what you got to understand is these big blocks here they were a big block, but they were a little bit of a different style of big block than what we're used to and what we see today. It was actually a bit of a different engine design. Those big blocks went away in, well, early 1965, and later that year, about mid-year 1965, is when we came out with the Generation 2 big block, which is what most of us are used to today. So the Gen 2 big block, the first year for production was 1965, actually mid-year 65. Now this engine was debuted in the Daytona 500 in 1963, and in fact it was dubbed the mystery engine because nobody really knew much about it, and it did really well, by the way. It actually did very, very well in Daytona. It's back before they limited the cubic inches in NASCAR, and they were running Hemis and they were running big block Chevys and so forth. So production began mid-year 1965. This engine had a dry weight of 685 pounds, and it was available in a 396 version. Okay, it was 396 cubic inches. We're going to also talk about the 402 and what those are all about. But the first big block was a 396. The 396 had a bore of 4.095 and a stroke of 3.760. It was available in 1965 in the Corvette and the Chevelle. This engine had a red line around 62, 6300. It was real comfortable running 6,000 RPMs. It wasn't a problem for that motor. It was rated at 375 horsepower that first year. Okay, so that's the Gen 2 big block, and we're not done with it, but that was the first year. What happened after that is in 66 they had a 427 that was available, and we'll talk about that. But they also had a 402. Now we got to talk about the 402 because GM did some really tricky marketing here with the 402. Now the 402 was first introduced in 1970, so we're fast forwarding a little bit. We're going to have to rewind to talk about the 427. But basically the 402, all it was a 30 over 396. They just bored the 396 block 30 over, and that made the cubic inches 402. So General Motors, they did some fancy marketing, and they still, in the Chevelles and the mid-sized cars that had the big blocks in them in 1970, they still called it a 396. You might You might have seen the 70 SS 396 Chevelle. Well, that was actually a 402. They didn't actually produce the 396 in 1970. It was a 30 over 396, which was a 402, but they called it a 396 in the Chevelle. Now, in the full-size cars like the Impalas, they called that 402 a 400. So you may pop the hood on a 1970 or 71 Impala that says 400 on the badges and find a big block under the hood. It is actually a 402. What's kind of interesting about that is at the same time Chevrolet also had a small block 400 available in those same cars. So you could have had 400 badges on the side of the car. You could have popped the hood and found a small block. You could have popped the hood and found a big block because they used the 400 cubic inch emblems for the 402 and the 400 small block. So kind of, I don't know, it's kind of a marketing thing. I think they just were trying to make it sound like they had more engines or options available than they actually had. I'm not sure what that was about. The other thing is that year, 1970, 71, right in that area, the same exact engine now, 402, they put it in the pickup trucks and called it a 402. So 396, 400, 402, it was exactly the same engine. They just had different designations for it depending on what vehicle it was in. Kind of a marketing thing. So it was the same engine. So that's the 402. It's basically a 396 that's 30 over. Now, in the late 60s, early 70s, this is just a bit of trivia here for you, but the big block Chevy engines became known as a rat engine because they were trying to contrast them with the small blocks. So a small block Chevrolet became known as, the slang term was, well, that's a mouse, and the big block Chevy became what's known as a rat. So in the hot rod world, in the high performance world, you might hear, yeah, that car's got a rat or it's got a mouse. That was kind of a slang term that was pretty popular though. Okay, so then we move on from there. Let's back up a little bit to 1966. They also had another big block come out in 1966, which was the 427, which by the way is a very, very good engine. The 427 had a 4.250 bore, which is the same bore as a 454, which came out later, but it had the same stroke as a 396, 3.760. So it was basically a 454 block with a 396 crank in it, basically. But the casting numbers and so forth for the original 427s make that motor worth a lot of money nowadays. This was available from 1967 to 69 in the Corvettes, and it had 435 horsepower. There were a few select vehicles in 66 that actually had 427s in them, but they really didn't come on strong until 67. And then of course the last year for that engine was 69. It's a shame because it was probably one of the best big blocks in my opinion that they made back in that era. It was a lot of people have said the 427 was a big block that thought it was a small block. So it would rev high, but it had the torque and the attributes of a big block. So it was actually a good running motor. Then of course in 1970 again, along with the 402, they introduced the 454. The 454 is probably the most common big block. It's the one that most of us are familiar with. 1970 the 454 came out. It had a 4.250 bore and a 4-inch stroke. So they increased the stroke to 4 inches, which bumped the cubic inches up to 454. In 1970, the LS5 version of the 454 was rated at 440 horsepower and 595 foot-pounds of torque. Now, rumor has it that those are very conservative estimates. They were worried about insurance companies. A lot of people claim that those engines actually had a lot more horsepower than that, but this is what they were advertising to the public. Possibly because of insurance reasons, I don't know. So the 454, very common big block. Then we move on. GM introduced a line of crate engines, the first of which was a 502. Now the 502 has a 4.466 bore, which is huge, and a 4-inch stroke. So it had the same stroke, but it had this gigantic bore, different bore spacing, completely different block. These engines were well above 600 horsepower, depending on the compression ratio, and the torque was right around in the same area. So this was a high-performance crate motor. It was never produced. It was never, should I say, installed in a production vehicle. This was a over-the-counter crate motor only that was available from GM. Another crate motor that they introduced in 1998, which is probably the most popular one, was the 572. Now the 572 is what they call the big block monster, or there's a lot of terms for it. This engine was available. It was 9.4 liters. It was available from GM with 620 horsepower and 650 foot-pounds of torque, and you could run that on pump gas. So it was a low compression engine. So for a pump gas motor, over the counter, pretty powerful engine. So a 572 over the counter big block. If you wanted the high performance version of that motor, they did have a high compression race gas version that was producing more than 720 horsepower right out of the crate. So if you're an enthusiast and you want a crate motor like this, you can get one of those from GM. All right, I know I've given you a lot of information here, and I'm going to get to the heads here in a minute, but I just wanted to give you some background. Another engine that GM actually is available, or was available for sale, and actually did come out in a production vehicle, which was trucks, was the 8.1 or the 8100. This is basically a 496 cubic inch. It was a Vortec engine. It had a 4.250 bore, which is the same as the 454, but it had a huge 4.370 stroke. So they put a really long stroke in this thing. It was actually a really good running motor. It was fuel injected, coil overplugged, the whole shot. So it was just a big truck engine. The 496, the thing about the 496 is one of the most common and one of the most least expensive stroker kits available today for the earlier 454s is actually a 496 stroker kit. So you can buy the stroker kit from pretty much any high-performance parts supplier, and you can stroke your 454, your early Generation 2 454, and you can make it a 496 cubic inch. Real popular stroker nowadays. Well, in 2006, we all got some very sad news about the big block, and that was that the big block Chevrolet was no longer produced after 2006. That was it. GM said we are no longer producing that engine. Okay, so the big block, the days of the big block were over. But don't panic. And the reason I say don't panic is because there are so many aftermarket parts available for the big block that you can literally build pretty much any big block you want. You can buy the blocks, the heads, the cranks, the rotating assembly. You can literally, there are companies everywhere producing aftermarket big block blocks and components, and you can build the big block if you want them. The parts are out there. Plus there's tons and tons of cores available. There's tons of cores out there. Still, they made millions of these engines. There's a lot of them around available for rebuild. Okay, so let's talk about the heads themselves, just so you get a basic idea. Now, I don't really want to get into lots and lots of casting numbers, and the reason I don't want to do that is because there's so many. It's way easier to break it down this way. The best way I found to break it down is like this. Okay, so what we have on the big block Chevrolet heads, what you really want to look at is you really want to look at the intake ports. So there's basically 3 intake ports. There's variations of those, but there's basically 3. The first port that we want to talk about is what they call the square port or the rectangular port. Now, I don't actually have a set of square port or rectangular heads here, unfortunately. But what I did is I took a square port intake gasket and I traced the yellow port lines here. So you can see that this is an oval port head, obviously, but the square port head, the rectangular port head, had a very large intake runner, very large port. it was basically a rectangular or a square port that was a high performance factory head. These were produced for Corvettes. There was a lot of high performance factory big blocks that had these. Some of the Chevelles had them and so forth. So those are out there, although they're quite expensive and they're not really as readily available as the oval ports. You can find them if you really look. If you really want to know more about that, just get on eBay or Craigslist or Wikipedia or something, or just go to Google and type in square port big block Chevrolet heads and you'll see tons of pictures of these ports. They're huge. Now, there's been a debate for many, many years. In fact, most of the square port, rectangular port guys that swear by those heads, and don't get me wrong, they're great performing heads, they kind of look down their nose at the oval port guys like, you guys really don't have, you guys really aren't at the level we are. However, over the years, what has happened is many people have actually compared these heads. Carcraft magazine did it many years ago. Hot Rod magazine's done it. Hot Rodding's done it. They flow tested them. They put them on an engine, same engine, and dyno tested them and so forth. Most of the consensus of what these people testing these heads have come up with is that the large oval port head, which is what you have here, which was produced, well, it's been produced ever since the big block was around, for street performance is probably the best choice. The problem with these big rectangle ports on the street is below about 3,500 to 4,000 RPMs, they really don't make a lot of power because they have such a large port. The air velocity going into the port is very poor at low RPM. So on a street car that's probably not, not going to see super high RPMs all the time, the general consensus is that the large oval port big block, which is what this is, and that's the second one here, this is the oval port, is probably the best choice for a street rod. And these heads work very, very well. They actually even work better if you put a larger valve in them. What I do here when I build these is this is the factory valve that's in there. We actually take and we open them up and put a larger valve in. These heads respond really well to large valves and they work great on a street car. So that's really the difference between the two top tier heads, the rectangular port and what we call the large oval port. Now, there's a couple of casting numbers that you want to look for. Like I said, I don't want to really get into a lot of casting numbers, and the reason that I don't is, well, because there's so many out there. But the two casting numbers that you really want, and there's a lot of other ones, don't get me wrong. I know I'm probably going to get comments about from a lot of you saying, well, what about this number? What about that number? These are certainly not the only good heads, but they are the two castings that are really most available today, and they were made basically in the mid to later 70s, and they're actually a really good head. The ones you want to look for is a 366-781, 781, or a 353-049. So a 781 or an 049, very good heads. They are an open chamber head. They have about 120 cc's, so with a flat top piston they're definitely going to be something you're going to be running pump gas on very easily, probably 8.5 to 1, somewhere in there. But if you're building the stroker engine like a 496, of course that's going to bump your compression up, or you can always go with a dome pop-up piston and they work fantastic. Okay, so these heads flow really well. This is a 781 head here with the large oval, and you can see it's got the big open chamber, and we actually, if you have the bigger valves put in and so forth, and you get, with a little bit of porting work, not a lot, just a little bit of porting work, open it up, smooth them out a little bit, have the bigger valves put in, these heads can easily support 500 horsepower. If you put them on a 496, you stroke the motor out, we've seen well above 600 horsepower with these heads. So that's a really good head when you get that kind of power out of it. Okay, so the large oval is very good. And of course, if you want all-out racing, the the rectangular ports, you know, if you're going to race wide open throttle, the rectangular ports, granted, are going to flow better than these oval ports. They're going to move more air on the top end. But in the RPM range where you really drive a street car, they're not going to perform. That car's going to be a little bit sluggish on the low end. Plus, they're really expensive. Now, that brings us to another head that is really common out there, and that's this one. Now, this is a really good head if you don't want to build a street rod. Okay? It's a decent head for a pickup truck. It's actually a really good head for an off-road rig if you want to do some rock crawling and so forth and you want lots of torque. This has a really small port. This is called the peanut port head, and we'll try to put these as close together as we can here so you can see the contrast. We got quite a difference in size here. We got about 1.5 inches. If we measure this port this way, we got about 1.5 inches from top to bottom. And if we measure the oval port here, we got about 2 inches. Okay, I measured them earlier. We ended up with about 2 inches. So we got about a 1/2 inch difference. This port is oval, but it's very short, and you can see it's a lot shorter than this one here. It's like, I don't know, it's like they took some big heavy thing and smashed the port down and made it small. It's a tiny port. Okay, so it's important that you understand, when you see these heads, they look similar. When you look at the big block heads, let's try not to knock these over and kill myself, they do look similar. I mean, the exhaust ports look similar, pretty much everything on the head looks similar. Even the combustion chambers are similar, although the valves, I believe, on this peanut port head are just a little bit smaller. But you got to really make sure you look at these intake ports, because if you're looking for a performance head to make big horsepower numbers on the street with you know, your big block, you really want to stay away from these heads. And guys will try to sell you these, oh yeah, big block Chevy, you know. Well, if it's a peanut port, it's worthless for high performance. It's great if you want to build a torque monster, you want to build if you're building a stock truck, you want to tow a trailer with it, these are fantastic. The small ports make a lot of velocity at low RPM, very high velocity because of the restriction of the port, which gives you very good low to mid-range torque. However, these also give incredibly good torque, and we have a very large flow capacity, so these things are going to flow really well up into the high RPM ranges and make a lot of power. So that's basically it. I mean, those are the 3 ports that you're basically going to see on these big block heads. Now, I know that's certainly not all there is. I'm sure I'm going to get tons of comments about, what about this one, what about that one? Because, I mean, the subject of big blocks is huge. There's so many out there, but I wanted to try to break it down the best I could. My advice to you, find an 049 or a 781. If you want to bump the compression up, put a dome piston in it. We've had really good luck with these. This is a 781 head here. I've got like 8 sets of these right now that I'm going to be building and putting the big valves in because there's such a big demand for them. The guys running these things on the street love them. So if you have an early big block, that's what you want to look for. If you want to make lots of power, go for the large oval port. That's my advice. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Make sure that you subscribe below. Make sure you like this video. Tell your friends about it. And if you have any requests, if you have anything you want me to add to this, let me know. We can also do a part 2 if we get enough, you know, requests or enough people wanting to know more information. I can jot some stuff down and we can actually do a part 2. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you all had a Merry Christmas, and until next time, we'll do it again, and thanks for watching.